This is In the Loop with Jack Blake, an Indy 11 podcast. We bring you an insight into the lives of professional athletes with an emphasis on the mental side of sports.
Welcome to In the Loop. Today we've got a fascinating episode I'm really excited for. We've got the first non-football athlete on the show, which offers a different insight into the mental side of the game and maybe the sport. We have someone who's been part of the men's gymnastics Olympic team at the 2012 London Olympics. They actually won bronze. He's a three-time junior European champion, had an amazing career in the world of gymnastics, and a childhood friend who I had the pleasure of playing football with early on, which I'm sure we'll get into. Welcome to the show, Sam Oldham.
Thank you for having me, Jack. It's great to be here, mate. I'm really looking forward to being on a podcast that's not necessarily about gymnastics.
Yeah, mate. No, I think it's really fascinating. I want to start off with your journey. You've been born in Keyworth in Nottinghamshire in England, close to where I'm from. What was it like growing up for you, mate, early doors?
I think for me, Jack, when I think about my earliest memories are football, and they are watching the 98 France World Cup final where France won. I remember that like clear as day with my dad sitting in the living room, and I wasn't very old, maybe I was like 4 or 5. And then a year later, Man United winning the treble, and just more than anything, what I remember about that was how happy my dad was. Like, I genuinely feel like that's the happiest I've ever seen. It just, for me as a kid, that sticks out so much in my memory. And I think ultimately starting to play football and starting to do sport was when I first, they're the key memories for me, when I began to play football, began to get into gymnastics, try other sports, do PE at school, because schoolwork and the academic side didn't really speak to me in the way that using my body to express myself did. So as soon as I found sport, I was very competitive as well. It was my thing.
Yeah, it was kind of in the family genes as well. I know your dad was obviously heavily involved in football, and your grandfather, and how much history of sport has been in your family?
So there's been quite a lot, mate. And a lot of that I didn't find out until I was a bit older, but a footballing background for sure, definitely with the family. My granddad played to a good level. My dad played to a very good level. Me and my brother both got into the sport very early on. But prior to that, my great uncle was an ice skater for Great Britain. So he used to be up at 6 in the morning going to the ice rink in Nottingham, which is quite a famous ice rink in the UK. So the Nottingham Panthers played there, who are probably one of the biggest ice hockey teams in the UK. And so he would be at that rink at 6 in the morning, and my granddad would go to watch him. So I only found out about that as I was actually, to be fair, in my 20s, once I'd already competed at the Olympic Games, and I reconnected with that side of my family a little bit more. And then other than that, I think my grandma's father was a snooker player to quite a good level, but the gymnastics was very left field. There was no one that tried gymnastics, but it was certainly a football background. But yeah, lots of sport within the family, and all of my family are very short, so gymnastics was kind of like the perfect sport for that.
Well, to give the listeners and the viewers to a bit more insight into how we know each other, we actually played football together at Notts County, which, for anyone that doesn't know Notts County, they're playing in League One in England right now. But they are the oldest professional football club in the world. 1862 they were founded. And yeah, we played in the academy. I think I was maybe 6 or 7, and you were a couple of years above me, maybe 8 or 9 at the time. And so yeah, we go back a long way, don't we, mate?
We do, yeah. I mean, see, I remember when I first played football, Jack. So my first ever game, my dad was incredibly embarrassed because I was playing a year up. I think I was 4 or 5, and I picked the ball up, ran with it, and threw it in the goal. And that's a real story, because I must have seen rugby on TV the weekend before.
Yeah.
My dad was very embarrassed. My mum was telling him, "Come on, you can't tell him off like that." Like, he didn't know what he was doing. And then I got picked up quite quickly, initially actually by Forest. So Forest saw me first, and I went on a 6-week trial. I went to this trial, and it was okay, but didn't really enjoy it. The thing I remember most about that trial was actually that at the time my dad had a Top Loader CD, and I just used to replay Dancing in the Moonlight. And
Oh, I was listening to that the other day, mate.
He used to always get me a McDonald's on the way back. So I'd go there, but at the same time that I was on trial for Forest, I've been picked up by Notts County, and they seemed to take way more of an interest and for me, I just enjoyed it straight away. And I played a year up for the first year because I think at that time they didn't have an under sevens team, maybe just an under eights team. Played a year up, then the next year they had a team, and I played at Notts County then until I decided to walk away from the sport of football, commit fully to gymnastics. But I met yourself when we were probably around the age of 8 or 9. And I always remember with you, you were one of those kids that was playing a year up, 2 years up at times, but was always very like, you were physically able to handle that step up, which I think set you apart. And I think for myself, because I also used to play a year up at times and sometimes 2 years up, the reason why I was able to do that also, I was small, but because of my gymnastics, I was very strong for somebody my age. Now, as I got older and I went to secondary school, then everybody grows and everybody's taller and everybody kind of caught me up. But in those early years, around the age of 8 or 9 or 10, I could handle playing against big defenders because I was really strong physically.
Right. So as like a, let's say 9, 10-year-old, what was your daily routine like trying to balance gymnastics, football, school? Like what was an average typical day for you?
Yeah, so when I say this out loud, mate, it sounds absolutely mental, but legitimately, I was training like 40 hours a week in the gymnastics from the age of about 9 years old. So it got pretty serious pretty fast. And when I was a kid, I kind of had this idea that I wasn't very naturally gifted in gymnastics. And that actually, I just had to work really hard in comparison to other people. And when I look back now, with the value of hindsight and being an adult and a man, I realized that actually my ascension into the elite side of gymnastics happened very fast because I started very late. I was only 7 when I started gymnastics. Now, typically, you get a lot of gymnasts starting at like 3 or 4 doing kind of mums and tots classes. That's very typical in gymnastics. But for me, I was quite not a late bloomer, but I was late getting into the sport. But actually, by the age of 8, so less than a year later, I had my first trial for the GB team. So it's crazy to think that, I'd done gymnastics for a year, was already getting spotted to potentially join the British gymnastics team, but I didn't think in my head that I was that talented. I think that really helped me as a kid because it meant that I felt like I had something to prove all the time.
Yeah.
But in terms of the training I was doing at that point, by the time I was 8 or 9, on a Monday, let's say I would wake up at 6 in the morning. My dad would wake me up, and I used to share a bunk bed with my brother. I was on top bunk, so I'd kind of crawl down the steps, try not to wake him up. I'd go downstairs, I'd eat my breakfast. My dad would take me to the gym, and the first thing we'd have to do is we'd have to run around the field in the cold, and sometimes it'd be pitch black. You'd be on your own, and you'd be running around this field at like 9 years old. You had to do 2 laps. And if you didn't do 2 laps, the coach was definitely watching. You'd have to go back out and finish your laps. So you do 2 laps, you go in the gym, we'd do conditioning. And I used to be very frightened of those sessions in those early mornings because when I first started, I was like 8 years old, 9 years old, training with like 16-year-old guys, like 16-year-old lads, which is obviously a massive age gap, very daunting, quite intimidating. But it meant that because I was able to do those extra sessions in the morning before school, my development just really picked up fast. So I'd go back to school then at 9 in the morning. I'd be at school all day. Then at 3 o'clock, my mum would pick me up. She'd drive me to the gym and I'd train for 5 more hours in the evening. And I'd do that on a Monday all the way through to a Friday. Then a Saturday was a big day of gymnastics. So I'd start at 9, I'd finish at 5 with an hour break in the middle. And then in terms of football, I would train I think it was 2 nights a week. I think it changed depending on your age group, but let's say it was a Tuesday night. I'd do everything I did on a normal day. So gym in the morning, school, gym. I'd finish a little bit earlier, get straight over to football, train at football, then come home, and then be up at 6 the next morning. I'd do that 2 nights a week. And then my day off from gym was a match day on a Sunday. So in terms of volume of work, it was just crazy. And obviously I'm trying to do schoolwork on top of that. So I think when you say it, people are like, surely not. But legitimately, that's what I used to do, yeah, when I was at that age.
So you think like first, I guess the first question I have off that would be, do you feel in your body now, all those hours that you've trained, do you feel the effects negatively now? Is that something you wake up in the morning and you're like, oof, all those bars we're doing, all that core work, like I'm really struggling? Or is that something that your body maybe as you're young can deal with and then you've adapted over time and it's actually helped you? Which one would you say?
It's a very interesting question, that is, Jack, because as a gymnast, even as a young guy at 13, 14, we would joke about being in a wheelchair by the time we're 30. It would just be an off-comment joke. We'd joke about we're going to have arthritis in our hands by the time we're 40 and all of this kind of stuff. And I think prior to retirement, I really thought, right, my body is completely battered and I'm just going to struggle for the rest of my life. But I think the frame at which I was looking at was through the lens of somebody that competes at the very highest level. But actually, for normal everyday life, you don't need to be swinging around a high bar with 7 times your gravity going through your body. Like, you don't have to be doing triple somersaults and landing without moving your feet. You don't have to do that anymore. So actually adapting to life after gymnastics hasn't been actually physically too challenging. One thing I would say is that there are a few scars that I have that certainly mean that I'm not able to necessarily do what I would want to be able to do. One of those is my shoulder. So when I was a kid, the one thing I certainly wasn't naturally gifted in was shoulder flexibility.
Okay.
When you do gymnastics, for me, the toughest apparatus is the rings, right? Because the
Yeah.
human body is not supposed to do that. Your shoulder joint, if someone described it like this to me once, like your shoulder joint is like a ball and socket. You've got to imagine all the like tendons and ligaments, they all come off like legs of a bar stool. And when you twist them round, they all tangle up. And that's kind of what happens with my shoulder. It's why my posture is terrible and I sit with my shoulders forward. And that right shoulder has caused me quite a lot of issues since retiring. So I know that I have 3 full thickness tears in that shoulder, one in my infraspinatus, one in my supraspinatus, and I split the head of my bicep. And ultimately, I'm going to have that operated on
Okay.
because I've been told that if I don't, the likelihood is that I will get arthritis in there as I'm older. And, I don't want to be in a position in 10 years' time where I can't lift my son up or throw a ball or do that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Having said that, what you said about being younger and working around and adapting, the amazing thing is that even though I have those weaknesses there in my shoulder, everything else starts to work and figures out a way, and I can still actually lift weights. I lift more weights than I did when I was doing gymnastics. I do jiu-jitsu. I'm still doing a bit of gymnastics. So really, it's not too bad. I expected it to be a lot worse, but I think the problem was being able to compete at that very high level was where by the time I was in my mid-20s, that volume of work I did when I was a kid caught up with me. And
Right.
I just couldn't hack the demands of gymnastics at the very highest level by the time I was in my mid-20s because there were so many miles on the clock.
Right. So I guess from a physical standpoint, yeah, it's kind of goes both ways. You've got a few scars. I'm very interested in the mental side of your routine at 9, 10 years old is an extremely dedicated one.
Yeah.
One it takes a lot of dedication, a lot of, I guess, sacrifices even at that age. Is that something when you were a kid around your school peers and stuff? I guess for parents watching this, what did that give you an extra bit of mental strength as kind of set you apart to the other kids in your class? Or did you feel like when you were at school, you were able to be a kid again, or were you able to separate them? Or did that structure and routine and dedication, did that really give you and set you apart from the other friends?
Yeah, another great question, mate. Like really good. And some of these questions, I've probably not really had time since I retired to sit down and reflect on. But I think as a kid, mentally, I was very tough, very strong, very self-critical, incredibly competitive. Um, I think you would maybe look at me from the outside, and I think if someone looked at me from the outside as a 9 or 10-year-old, they would maybe imagine that I had a very pushy set of parents.
Mm.
I didn't. I had parents that certainly, and I say parents, it was more probably from my dad. The things that he pushed were attitude, like work ethic, these things. He wouldn't let me get away with being lazy or being rude or those type of things. But it was very much self-driven. And it's an odd thing to see a 9 or 10-year-old that if I was left in the gym by myself, for instance, let's say my coach went to the toilet or had to go and do something for 10 minutes and we were in the gym by ourselves, my thought process was, he's going to think I've not done anything. So I need to do more than he's asked me to do to combat the fact that he's going to think that I've been lazy. So that was kind of my mindset as a child. And I know now as an adult, as a 31-year-old, that I was recently, a year ago, diagnosed with ADHD and also obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And what comes with obsessive compulsive personality disorder is that you tend to see the world very much in black and white. And it wasn't until I was about 26 I had a conversation with one of my ex-teammates. and we went and played a game of pool in a pub. And at the time, I was struggling massively mentally myself at that time as a 26-year-old. And I said, "You were always the talented one." And he said, "What are you talking about? You were the talented one, not me." I was like, "What?" Because this is my whole narrative that I created through my whole life was that I had to work harder than everybody else. And this guy had come in and kind of took a sledgehammer to that. And he said, "Yeah, I remember we used to have to climb a rope. So we used to have to, the rope in the gym is 10 meters high, right? And if you're a 9-year-old kid, and if you're a gymnast, you're going to be a small kid. That's a long way up, right? And I'd go and climb that thing, and I wouldn't be scared of how high it was. And 10 meters to a roof, there's nothing holding you on. You fall, that's it. And I would climb up that rope, and sometimes we'd have to do it 2, 3, 4 times a day. And he said, "I asked you once, like how you got up the rope." And he said, "Do you remember what you said?" I was like, "No." And I must have been 9 or 10 at this age. And apparently I said to him, "Well, I imagine someone's going to do something to my mum or dad, and that's what helps me get to the top." And I look back now and then I was like, wow, that's such an odd thing for a 9 or 10-year-old to say, that I'm already playing these mental games in order to push myself through these things that are very difficult. And so I think it did set me apart in a sporting context, but I did like the fact that when I went to school, and particularly when I played football, it was completely different.
Mm-hmm.
That was fun for me. Like I enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Whereas gymnastics felt very intense,
Yes.
very, very pressured because it was all on me. And then
Yeah.
I had to go up there, put my hand up, do my routine. As soon as you put your hand up, even as a 9-year-old kid, no one can help you. Your parents can't help you. The coach can't help you. You've got to do it. Whereas in football, there was a team aspect and it was about camaraderie, and the intensity level was way lower. And I really enjoyed that. So I think I was able to split those things apart. But maybe as I got older and became a teenager, I found it more and more difficult to do that. And they kind of wove into each other.
Mm. That's fascinating. That story's crazy. Was it 12 years of age that you made the decision? You were balancing football and gymnastics,
Yeah.
and then there was a period of time, and I remember when you left and chose gymnastics. I remember thinking that must have been a difficult decision to make because you're balancing those two things. Like you said, you have such a pressured environment on one side, so that could maybe deter you from choosing that route. Football you love so much, it's always been in your family.
Yeah.
Was it a solo decision or parents heavily involved with that? Like, how did you make that decision to choose gymnastics?
Do you know what, mate? It's really interesting. And the reason this is a very interesting question is that about 2 months ago, I had a message from a friend of mine who coaches in Ireland. And she coaches the women's side of a program in Ireland that's doing very well. And they have a men's side. And the message essentially was, "Sam, we've got a gymnast who's doing incredibly well at gymnastics. He's just made it onto the Irish team. He's actually going to be training with your coach, who is now the national coach of the Irish team, every Saturday morning. But he's also been scouted by Man City, and the parents do not know what to do, and they've got to make a decision between the two sports." And I was like, wow, I'm a perfect person to kind of. So I said, no problem. I'll speak to the parents on the phone. We'll FaceTime. I rang them. And I tried to give them the most honest feedback I possibly could. Now, I'm sure there was part of the gymnastics coach that wanted me to steer them in that direction. And I'm sure if I'd spoke to the football, they wanted, but I didn't do that like at all. I gave them everything. And I think for me, at the time of making that decision, it's a big decision. All my family, in terms of a sporting background, pretty much is football. And you have to understand that my granddad was a very good player, but never quite made it to the level he wanted to play at. And my dad was exactly the same. So within them, I would say within my dad and my granddad, there is a level of personal regret that things didn't quite work out for them. So I think my career in terms of their advice at times and certainly protection, they were very fearful of me feeling the pain that they felt, right? They were scared of that. And I think without knowing subconsciously, that maybe influenced some of the support that I got. Now, what my parents did incredibly well in this moment was I think they were very aware that this has to be his decision.
Mm.
So the decision that I made was at a time when Notts County had just gone into administration. So the Centre of Excellence had recently just closed down, right? So I just competed for Great Britain for the first time ever, and I'd won the gold medal against all the best kids in the world. And at that point, it was like, okay, you can, and I now look back and go, right, you can, until a kid is 18, no one has a clue. So if anyone tells you they're going to make it, run a mile because they don't know. But realistically, it was looking like, how many kids want to be footballers? How many kids want to be gymnasts? I've dedicated so much to this already. There was certainly an element of, I can't waste everything that I've committed to this. Like, I've given up so much, you know. There was certainly an element of that. And if I'm perfectly honest, there was a little bit of an element of fear, not necessarily from my parents, but more from the gymnastics side when it came to my coach at the time, that I was like, I'm very much a people pleaser and I'm very scared of upsetting people. And I was very worried about his reaction if I'd have picked football. And that certainly played a role, mate. And what I definitely didn't do was pick the thing that made me the happiest, because
Interesting. Yeah.
football made me happy. And I could play football for 8 hours a day and never get tired, whereas gymnastics was a different animal.
Mm,
And I felt as a 12-year-old that that competitive edge that I had in me, and already that self-critical element, that if I picked football, I was picking the easy way out.
mm,
And what determined my decision ultimately was that I felt like if I picked football, I'd always have in the back of my mind, you chickened out of that because you know that that thing over there is way harder than this is in terms of the intensity, the stress, and the physicality of it. And you've picked the thing that you enjoy. And as a child, I hadn't computed yet that if you enjoy something that makes you happy, I felt like, well, that's not as worthwhile as doing something very difficult. Does
yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
as a kid, these were the conversations I was having in my head. And ultimately, I think that's what steered me down that direction. Now, as a 31-year-old man, I'm so happy I made that decision because of the life that I've led. It's made me the man that I am. And the great thing is that I can now play football again and have fun. Whereas if I'd have played football, I'd have never gone back to gymnastics just for fun because you just can't do it that way around.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's why I asked you earlier where you have the routine from such a young age, and it gives you that almost maturity to then make those decisions at the age of 12. Because you have ask a 12-year-old, you know, most of them have not got a clue what day it is, let alone, what choose as a route forward. I think I want to fast forward to 2011, which I think was probably a big year for you because you were included in the British squad for the first time, and you had the looming black cloud or maybe golden cloud of the London Olympics coming along. And I know that was obviously a big thing in the country. For so long we hadn't hosted an Olympics, and then we get the opportunity to do it in 2012. You're one of the Olympic athletes that your goal has always been to be there.
Yeah.
What if you could rewind to 2011,
Yeah.
involved in the first squad of the British squad in Germany? What was that experience like?
It was a great time, mate, when I look back, because, I often say that there is a massive advantage to being naive in high level sports and being young because you just don't understand the game yet, the rules, the politics. You kind of come in as a bit of a disruptor. And for me at that time, when I look back now, up until the age of about 21, I was just an animal. People used to call me an animal in terms of my competitiveness, my self-drive, my self-belief. It was unwavering, even at times when it was almost felt impossible to overcome some of the obstacles that I faced in the build-up just to that Olympic Games in 2012. But in 2011, when I came onto the team, the senior team, I would say at that point, the way I would describe myself was fearless, just fearless. Like, I looked at it like, I'm going to beat all of these guys on this team. And I had no business really thinking that at 17, which was when I first made the team, the senior team. I was 17 at the back end of 2010. I went to the World Championships and watched the team. I was the reserve, so I did everything but compete. Watched that whole experience, saw the best in the world, just engrossed myself in that environment. And then 2011 came back, and at the start of that year, just hit the ground running, got selected for the European Championships in Germany as an 18-year-old, and became the first British man in history ever to make a major championship final on the high bar. I was competing against some of my idols who went on to become some of the greatest high bar workers of all time. And like, I watched that routine recently, and I was like, oh God, I just wasn't daunted by that experience at all. There was 15,000 people in the arena. I remember being in the tunnel before you go out, and it was, you have to wait for like 10 minutes. You get nervous. And I was just in the zone, like completely just couldn't be phased. And they were playing We Will Rock You, and the crowd was stamping their feet, and the whole crowd, the arena was shaking.
Wow.
And it was
Man,
awesome.
I'm getting goosebumps right
I
now.
did like the best. I did such an incredible routine. It was an amazing routine. And I finished just shy of the medals. I finished fourth. But the guy that went on to win the Olympic gold medal the year later was the guy that won that competition. And it was just for me the most incredible experience. And that was a bit like right, I'm here now. And at that point, people really started taking me very seriously. And I was considered at that time to be one of the best new talents in the world. And I think going then into the summer, what actually happened at that point was that I was doing a lot of gymnastics that hadn't been done yet by a British gymnast. So I was almost a lab rat in a way. So I was doing very difficult gymnastics, and I picked up quite a serious injury to my collarbone that summer doing skills where you land on the parallel bars, essentially on the bottom of your biceps like this, and you take a lot of force through that. And I just wasn't physically developed enough to handle that stress. And I got a stress fracture in my collarbone, and then I had to battle through trying to make the world championship team that year. I did do that, but in doing that, I made it a lot worse. And when we competed at the world championships, I was the first guy up on the rings. I did a crucifix and I tore my pec. My pec just tore completely. And I actually finished every apparatus. So I did all 6 apparatus. And the whole way around, I was like, wow, this is like on fire. What's going on here? Finished the competition. And then what had happened in that event, and the reason that that was one of the best experiences I've ever had, was that we were just expected to qualify for the Olympics at that event. So we were going to get in the top 10 easy. It wasn't going to be a problem. And the night before the competition, it was between me and a guy called Max Whitlock, who's the most successful British gymnast of all time. And they left it until the day before the competition to decide which one of us was going to compete on the day for the senior team. We were both 18. We're a month apart in age, which is a crazy thing to do because this is like the biggest competition in history for British gymnastics and men's gymnastics. And the night before, the coaches sat me down and said, Sam, you're going to compete, but you don't have to worry because the team is so experienced that even if you have a couple of mistakes, it's not going to affect us at all. And then what happened was all of the senior guys on the team, they all had a nightmare and fell off like 3 times each. We didn't qualify for the Olympics. And then we were just like the disgrace of gymnastics. It was terrible. The coaches wouldn't even speak to us. We weren't allowed to go to Disneyland with the women's team because we'd been such an embarrassment. We traveled out on business class. They sent us back on economy. It was a nightmare, mate. And then it meant that I had a real uphill battle to get to the Olympic Games in 2012 because I now had a torn pec, a stress fracture, and they said you have to do 2 months complete offload. You're not even allowed to do a press up, and then you can start training. So yeah, a crazy 2011, and that meant that going into 2012, my back was properly against the wall to try and get back in time and make it onto the team.
So when your back's against the wall in that sort of environment, in that hostile, pressurized environment, like you said, you had your own people turning against you.
Yeah.
What was it that gave you then the ability to go and do what you did at the Olympics?
I think, mate, it was that self-belief, and when I've sat down and spoke to athletes from lots of different sports, Olympic medalists, champions, and the one thing that I always come out with, that I personally feel, having done 90 episodes now of my own podcast where I interview athletes, the one thing that sets apart the good from the great is the self-confidence and self-belief, and it has to be unwavering. That's the one thing, because it's going to mean you'll go the extra mile. And when most people will give up and just think it isn't going to happen, they'll just hang in just long enough. I think quite often in sport, the people that make it at the end are the ones that hang on long enough. I've said that to my brother. My brother plays semi-professional football. I remember a few years ago saying to him, look, Jack, you never know, mate. Like, quite often it's the kids or the people or the men or the women or the girls that just hang on long enough to get that one opportunity. That everybody's probably seen that meme of that guy that's mining and he's just about to get to the diamond and he turns away, and it's that. And I think it's that unwavering self-belief. And going into 2012, I had no business like being on that team at all, but I just believed that I could pull it off. And it was right at the last moment in the trials that I just made it impossible for them not to put me on the team. And they tried not to put me on that team. Gymnastics is incredibly political, but they just couldn't. And so I ended up on that team. And when we went to 2012, I think I was one of the athletes that was very studious when it came to my sport. Like I knew everything about gymnastics From when I was a child, I used to study the sport. I'd just buy VHS tapes online, just watch them again and again and again. I knew everything about it. So going into that competition, I knew that we could potentially win a medal. Now, the rest of my teammates, whether or not they were just doing this to try and keep calm, but they kept very relaxed. And I think their attitude was, oh, look, we made it here. This is just anything after this is a bonus. And I feel like that maybe they did that on purpose because they were a little bit more experienced than I was. They were 2 or 3 years older than me, but I was going into that thinking we can do this. And, it was magical, man. It was, everything came together just at the right time. We'd not won many medals at the Olympic Games at that point. So we were crying out for medals. It was a Saturday night, primetime TV, and we had 20,000 people in that arena going crazy. And it went our way.
Was there one memory that stands out to you that you can describe, whether it was the opening ceremony or even the event itself? Was there a moment? I want to kind of dive into your mind and kind of feel what it was like for you in that moment. Was there anything that stands out to you from the London Olympics?
There's a few things, mate. I think the first thing was when I first arrived. I arrived there, you get your accreditation, which is your passport to get into the training venue, the competition venue, the dining hall, the Olympic Village. We get off the bus because we had our holding camp out in France, away from the media. We walk into essentially the big marquee where you go through the processing of getting your ID. And I got in this queue and I turned around and the guy behind me was Michael Phelps. I did a double take and I was like, whoa! And I looked at Max in front of me. I was like, do you know who that is? Like, that's
Michael
Phelps. Yeah, and he was massive, mate. But at that moment, it hit me then. And I think I got pretty overwhelmed, like nervous, like, whoa, this is the Olympics. Like, because you can dream about it, right? From being a child. But like actually being there, like actually making it, like the stats are crazy. I think the odds of being an Olympian are 1 in 150,000. The odds of winning a medal are 1 in a million within the UK, right? So it's not many kids. So to have made it, that was certainly a moment for me. And then I think, the first day of competing was amazing. I did incredibly well. But the two moments that stick out in the competition that were big for us were that my team captain, Christian Thomas, he stuck his vault. And everyone went crazy because it was one of the hardest vaults in the world. And it was a real moment of that games that when he stuck that vault, we kind of felt something. It was like, okay, like this might just be, it was like an out of body experience of watching a film. And then on the high bar, I actually fell from the high bar. So in the Olympic Games, I fell and 20,000 people went like that. And when 20,000 people do that, it doesn't feel good, man. Yeah. So as a 19-year-old kid, I was able to compose myself, calm down, because you only have 30 seconds to get back on the bar. I chalked my hands up and I finished off, and it was pretty much a perfect rest of my routine. But I'm thinking I've just cost my country the first Olympic medal in 100 years. I'm going to be public enemy number one. My brain's thinking back to a year ago at that World Championships, and I'm thinking it's not going to be the whole team this time. It's going to be all on me and my shoulders. And I looked over and saw a Russian gymnast on the parallel bars, and they were neck and neck with us at the time, and he fell. And when his score came up, it was lower than mine, and I thought, maybe. And then credit to our team captain again, Christian Thomas. He went up after me, smashed his routine, and it felt like he saved me in that moment. And we went on. The boys hit their floor routines, and when it came up on the scoreboard, it was just disbelief. We just couldn't. You could have never dreamed of it because it was like the impossible dream. When I was an 11-year-old kid and I watched the Olympics on TV, Great Britain were ranked 23rd in the world. So in 7 years to go from 23rd to 3rd is just a fairy tale story. And it was, incredible moments, mate.
So the Olympic bronze medal was such a high for you that, especially at the Summer Olympics in London, I want to take you past that, maybe some of the negative sides that mentally you struggled with. There was a Times article that I saw that the headline, whether or not you said this or not, I don't know, but the headline read, "For a long time, I was ashamed of my Olympic medal." What was maybe the negative mental battles that you went through after the Olympics and prior to retirement? Like, what was that period of time like for you?
Yeah, and look, mate, I don't necessarily remember that specific article, but that is exactly how I felt. It's true. I felt ashamed of my medal, and the reason why is that I couldn't compute in my head how I'd fell and won a medal. It made no sense to me, and it probably goes back to that black and white thinking. It just didn't. I didn't get that. You win or you lose. Like if you fall off, how can you then win a medal? And I felt like everybody around me, although that they were celebrating and they couldn't believe it and they were so happy for me, they're actually thinking, but he doesn't deserve it because he fell off. And that mental battle for me was just torment, and it was very destructive. And what I should have done at that point is gone and asked for help, because for a long time I couldn't understand why none of my teammates asked me if I was okay, because I felt like my behavior was screaming I'm not okay. But I now realize that they were only 22, and at
Yeah.
22
Yeah.
I wasn't in a position at 22 to check in on the 18 or 19-year-olds, because I was still dealing with my own stuff. And they were also in that whirlwind of what was going on at the Olympic Games. So, you know, now it just nobody knew how to handle that situation. I didn't, the people around me didn't, British gymnastics certainly didn't, Team GB didn't know, my teammates didn't. And for me, I really, really struggled with that. And what was really interesting was I watched a documentary a number of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it was about the Champions League final where United won, but Ronaldo missed a penalty.
Hmm.
And he talked about how he felt that Van der Sar had like saved his life. That's how
Yeah.
he spoke about it,
Wow, that's so similar to your situation.
And that's how I felt. I felt that Christian had saved my life. And they sound like very extreme terms, but actually, for me, gymnastics was very much life and death. And you can go back to the way that I used to talk to myself in my head, right, about climbing that rope, and the story of, oh, I imagine someone's going to hurt somebody that I love. It felt like that to me.
Mm.
And I think the big mistake I made as a kid was that I decided that I was going to measure the worth of my life off whether or not I became the Olympic champion. So that was the measure and that was the bar. And anything less than that was never good enough. So I just set myself up to fail the whole of my career, essentially, until I hit rock bottom at the age of 26. Because even if I became the European champion, it wasn't, I'm the European champion. It was, well, it's not world. And
Yeah.
that would be what the voice inside my head would say. And if I became the world champion, it would have been, well, it's not Olympics. So when I won an Olympic bronze medal, it wasn't, you won an Olympic bronze medal. It was, yeah, but you fell and
Mm.
it's not gold. So, that was a very difficult thing to handle as a young person whose brain isn't fully developed yet. And after the Olympic Games, what happened was, I was somebody that was very disciplined, never really did the things that a normal young person would do in terms of my development. I missed out on that.
Mm.
I didn't have friends my own age. I didn't communicate with people my own age. I didn't know how to socialize with people my own age, boys and particularly girls, right? So after the Olympic Games, all of a sudden, everybody that I've ever known wants to be my best mate, and nobody's telling me you're not allowed to go out or drink or party. So as soon as I found alcohol, and it numbed those feelings I had of I'm ashamed of myself and everybody thinks I didn't deserve it, that became a bit of a problem. And because I have obsessive compulsive personality disorder and ADHD, but I didn't know about it, I didn't understand the way my brain was wired, and I'm
Yeah.
quite an extreme person. So that wasn't good for about a period of 6 months. But then I exhausted all of that, got back into the gym, got back into my structure and my routine, and that got back to normal. And then I was fully on 2016. And actually, the 2 years that followed that, my career went, if you were going to write down somebody's career as a gymnast, it was pretty much on paper perfect. I won major championship medals every year. I got better and better. And then going into the Commonwealth Games at the age of 21, I was one of the favorites to win. The gymnastics that I was doing was the best gymnastics I had ever done. The difficulty of the work I was doing, I think at the time, it was the third most difficult gymnastics in the world. And the only two athletes that were better were the two athletes that have done the most difficult gymnastics ever anyway. So that's where I was at. And then I got an ankle injury at that competition in front of 15,000 people in Glasgow at the Hydro Arena that completely derailed my career. And then at that point, that's when mentally the cracks began to show.
Yeah.
But again, I pulled myself together, got back on it, focused on getting back from the injury, spent 2 years of just doing anything I possibly could to get back, and got myself into the position in 2016 of being this close to making a second Olympic team after what was a career-shattering injury. At the end of the day, mate, I completely dislocated my ankle and ruptured every single ligament in my ankle. So they all needed to be operated on and essentially reconstructed. So all my ankles in my left ankle, sorry, all my ligaments in my left ankle are made out of carbon fiber. And he had to basically fix it rigid. So you can imagine for a sport like gymnastics, that's the problem. So
Ideal.
I had to change the way I did my gymnastics. It also meant that mentally I was just kind of all over the place. And then I came within this close of making the Olympic team for the second time. And I felt like I earned the spot based on the numbers and the results and my performances. And unfortunately, sport, sometimes you don't always get what you think you deserve, and it's not always fair. And there was certainly a lot of politics going on at that time. And I still to this day believe that I earned that spot. But, at the end of the day, gymnastics is a subjective sport, and it's one guy that gets to decide at the end. And I fell on the wrong side of that conversation. 4 years prior, I fell on the right side of it. And that really was very challenging. But again, still didn't really get to the point where I'd reached my rock bottom until 3 years later at the age of 26, when I just had a complete earth-shattering experience with mental health, and my whole world fell apart. And I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety and eating disorder, and I went into therapy. And yeah, I had to then really learn who the hell I was, because I just didn't know. I was completely lost. I was going around asking people for the answers. I was trying to, why am I here? I don't understand how I fit in. I don't get this. Somebody tell me. Obviously, you can never ask someone that question, right? Because it's very personal. You have to figure it out yourself. But I think the reason why I was able to get to a point now at 31 where my mental health is consistently good is that I reached literally my rock bottom and went, please help me. I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know what to do. I want this pain to go away. I can't get it to go away. I don't want to feel like this anymore. And yeah, for me, it was a long journey. It still is. It's a never ending thing. But yeah, again, I think if you're going to look back at your life, right? And people always ask me the question, like, if you were to do it again, would you do it again the same way? It's like an impossible question to answer. But if I'm going to answer that question by saying, no, I wouldn't change anything because it's made me the man I am, I think that I kind of owe it to myself and to the story to also acknowledge that, as well as there was a lot of tough parts of that journey, and it was very difficult, there were so many positives. And I need to be able to acknowledge the bad stuff, but also kind of put them to one side and remember the good stuff as well, because the positives far outweigh the negatives. But
Yeah.
it's very difficult to see that when you're in that hole and you can't see a way out. And yeah, very tough times, mate.
I think the achievements that you've done in your career, for me, listening to you speak then, it's what kind of for me would be your biggest achievement, and something you're still figuring out, and everyone is finding yourself, and understanding the niches and the quirks and the things that might be your diagnosis and stuff. And yeah, people see on the outside the achievements you do in your sport, but more importantly, the achievements that you earn for yourself are the ones figuring it out. And you've come from battles of injuries and the mental side. And mate, I think your story is so inspiring to people. And I know you do a lot of work now in the schools, and you're teaching gymnastics and stuff like that. And mate, you've what you've been through, and the journey you've had, and like you said, it's still ongoing,
Yeah.
is far superior to the Olympics, in my opinion. What you've done for yourself. And that's why earlier in the question I asked about the mental health, early on, when you're doing that routine and up early every morning, and potentially those things can take their toll. And I think that the journey you've had is so inspiring, mate. It really is. And I hope people enjoy the conversation that we've had. And you've been blessed with a child. Congratulations. What's it like being a dad, mate?
Oh, it's incredible, man. I had this conversation with you when I knew I was going to be a dad, when you came on the podcast last Christmas. And I had a lot of worries about being a dad. And I think and actually going back to when I was really struggling with my mental health, I can remember saying to my partner, like, I'm not sure I can be a dad, because I don't trust myself to be mentally well enough to handle that. And what happens if, if I go backwards and I end up, with depression, anxiety again. And actually, like having my son has given me so much purpose, and it's positively impacted my life in ways that I can't even explain. Just down to the fact that I spend so much of my time smiling and laughing now. Like outside of the fact that like my son, that can only be a positive thing to spend that much time just laughing and smiling. And he's brought so much joy into my life. He's just the most amazing little man. I love it. I've always wanted to be a dad. Uh, and and I'm trying to take all the little bits and pieces from all the people that I love, because there's been so many people in my life, my parents, all my family members, role models, my coach. So many people have been so generous with what they've given me and the opportunities they've given me. And, for me, it's about, I get asked this question. I think you even asked me this. Is he going to do gymnastics? It doesn't matter to me. Whatever he wants to do, he can do. For me, it's about being there and giving him as much of my time as I possibly can. But yeah, he's the coolest little boy in the world. Like, I'm so excited now to go and see him after this conversation, go see him, spend time with him. And I'm very, very lucky and fortunate that gymnastics has afforded me the lifestyle that I live right now. I have the podcast that I do. I go into schools, like you said, and I love that work, and I have my own coaching, and it means that I'm able to be flexible enough that every day I spend 2, 3 hours with him, without fail. And that time for me is just so precious, man. So yeah, I love it. It's like the best job in the world.
Yeah, it's brilliant, mate. Yeah, the podcast, for everyone listening, what's the name of your podcast? Where can they find it?
Yeah, so it's the Sam Oldham podcast, mate, and maybe quite interesting for some of your listeners. Gymnastics was certainly highlighted at the Olympic Games this year through Simone Biles, but also through Stephen Nedorosik, right? I know he's on Dancing with the Stars over in the States right now. So we actually were in talks with getting Stephen in once he's finished that show, which would be really exciting. And we've had a number of American gymnasts that competed at Paris this summer on. So we had Frederick Richard on. So there is that kind of transferable of American sport. So yeah, it's the Sam Oldham podcast, and you can download it on Spotify, Apple, anywhere basically you get your podcast. And it's also on YouTube, so you can watch the visuals every week. But yeah, I love it, man. And we'll have to get you back the next time you're back in the UK. And I would like a shirt as well, mate, because I collect
Oh,
football.
mate, no
That
problem.
would be amazing.
I'll straight over to you, mate. No problem. I guess final question. Ending on a fairly serious note, what would you, for someone like you described has been at rock bottom, what would you, if someone is battling themselves in that period of time, what would your one piece of advice be for someone?
Okay, that's a great question, mate. And when I go into schools, one of the questions I ask when I do an assembly is how many people have a voice inside their head, and every kid puts their hand up, right? And I say, when I was your age, that voice used to sound like this. You can't do it. You're going to fall off. You're going to make a mistake. What if you embarrass people? But by the time I got to the end of my career and I was 28 and I was about to do the final routine of my career, that conversation inside my head was completely different. That person in my head was my best friend. We worked together, and it was, you can do this. I believe in you. You're only doing this for yourself. You don't need to prove anything to anybody else. If you don't do it, that's okay. The fact you made it to this moment is enough. So I think working on that conversation that you have inside your head and making sure you guys are working together is really, really important. But I have to also acknowledge that I was very lucky to have been caught in a safety net, because I had the support of the EIS, which is the English Institute of Sport. So they picked me up and I was able to get therapy through that. Now, not everybody has that. But one thing for me that I still use to this day, and I use the acronym SEEK, as in seek help, is first and foremost, if I start to feel down or depressed or a bit low, I make sure that I'm sleeping properly. I make sure that I'm eating properly. I make sure that I'm exercising, and I make sure that I'm communicating with people. And if there's one thing in those four things that I'm not doing, so sleep, eating, exercising, and communicating, I put that right first. Then at that point, if it's still not good and I'm still feeling low and depressed, because normally one of those things will be missing from my life and I have to focus on that area. If I'm still really struggling at that point, then I reach out to somebody that maybe is a professional, so a doctor, and I talk to somebody professional. But those four things, anybody can do those and anybody can check them. So I think that's a really useful bit of information for anybody that's maybe struggling. I use that to this day and it really helps me.
Thanks, brother. It's honestly a pleasure to call you a friend. Really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I think it's been fascinating. Thanks again, brother.
Thank you, mate. It's been a pleasure.
This is In the Loop with Jack Blake, an Indy 11 podcast. Be sure to like and follow this podcast and check out other great podcasts on the All Indiana Podcast Network. To watch the video of this podcast, subscribe to the Indy 11 YouTube channel.